There was a belief in the Australian community, I think, if you have suffered on behalf of the nation, it should be the nation's responsibility to support you.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. When the Second World War ended, 22,000 Australian prisoners of war returned home. They had endured starvation, tropical disease, forced labour and humiliation. But another 8,000 never came back at all. Among those who did return was my grandfather, Alec Downer, who spent 3 years as a POW at Changi. And like so many of his generation, he rarely spoke of what he had endured and perhaps found that the hardest battle began only once the camps were behind him. These men came home to a country uncertain how to see them. Soldiers who had fought bravely but been captured. Survivors who did not quite fit the heroic Anzac mould. Some found their service quietly discounted, their trauma misunderstood. Others struggled to resume work or marriage, caught between gratitude for survival and the unspoken sense of shame that captivity carried. In the late 40s, this unease became a matter of national politics. The Chifley government rejected calls for a subsistence allowance for former POWs, arguing it would reward surrender. The Menzies government, by contrast, created a prisoner of war trust fund, not an automatic pension, but a system through which men could apply for individual grants. The result was an extraordinary archive of post-war testimony, handwritten accounts of broken health, lost careers, and the emotional toll of trying to resume ordinary life after extraordinary suffering. To discuss this hidden chapter of our history and what it tells us about how our nations remember, repair and redefine themselves, I'm very happy to be joined by historian Christina Twomey, who's a professor of history at Monash University and author of this book here, The Battle Within: POWs in Post-War Australia. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Christina.
Thank you very much.
Christina, this is a really, really fascinating account of how POWs, who we're familiar with their stories of Changi, the Thai-Burma Railway, and of course there were many POWs in Europe. We're familiar with those experiences, but not so much the experiences they had when they came home. And in modern day parlance, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and we sort of understand that. But back in the late 40s, 50s, there was no such language to describe what they were going through. So why did you choose this topic as a historian to look at their post-war experiences and trauma?
I think as a historian, I've always been really interested in the impact of significant global events or national events on individuals. So I have other work that's explored the legacy of being involved in a significant event. And I'd been familiar with the story of prisoners of war largely because of my own personal experience, which wasn't that I was, like you are, the grandchild of a former prisoner of war, but as a young person, I lived as part of an expatriate community in Malaysia that was linked to a Royal Australian Air Force base at Butterworth. And there was a real consciousness among that community that people just like us in that region during the Second World War had been caught up in war. And I initially wrote a book about civilian internees. So that was my first introduction to this topic because I really wanted to explore what happened to the civilians who were caught up in the Asia Pacific as Japan conquered that territory in the early 1940s. When I was researching that book, I came across the papers of the Civilian Internees Trust Fund. So the POW Trust Fund that you just mentioned had a twin that was called the Civilian Internees Trust Fund that nobody had ever written about. I don't think people even really knew it existed by the time I came to work on it, which was the 1990s. And I opened up the papers and just saw these amazing testimonies of what had happened to these men, women and children who'd been taken prisoner by the Japanese. And then I started to think about, because I'm a historian, I look at our significant national commemorations. And I realised that prisoners of war were a feature of Anzac Day in our own times in a way that they weren't in earlier generations. And I thought, what explains that change? What explains the fact that Australians post-war all knew that there'd been this significant group of people who'd been taken prisoner, but they didn't really feature in Anzac Day commemorations as the headline act until the mid-1990s. So I had those two questions rolling around in my mind. One was, how do POWs become a significant figure in the way we commemorate the Second World War? And the other question was, are there any archives that can tell us about what it was like for them in those post-war years, in that period when they weren't as fated as they are now? And I thought, I wonder if there's anything a bit like the Civilian Internees Trust Fund for POWs. And indeed there was. And those records had been filed away and no one had ever looked at them. And there were 7,000 applications to that fund.
Right. And so of the 22,000 POWs who returned home, about a third-ish had applied for support from this fund.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
And I opened up the files and started to read them, and just this amazing story rolled out, which we can talk about a bit more in a minute.
So I think it's really interesting to reflect on how we talk about POWs now. I mean, I talk about my grandfather being a POW because it's a really formative experience for him as a man in his 20s. Obviously, life is completely diverted. He can't do anything. He can't fight. He can't go back to Australia. He's stuck. But it's the interactions he has during that period that I think really inform him and his journey then into politics afterwards. But he, by all accounts, never really talked about the experience when he got home. And I wonder if it's that sense that it was a bit shameful to have been captured. You didn't fight for your country because you couldn't, because you were captured. And in a way, I mean, you might have been put in the Thai Burma Railway under horrific conditions of hard labour, but for him, sitting in Changi, it was horrific, but you also weren't doing very much.
I think the prisoners were placed in a really difficult position, and the word that I use to describe the response to them is ambivalent. So on the one hand, there's enormous sympathy in Australia that these servicemen and women, because there were women prisoners of war as well, had been captured by the enemy, and some of them had had dreadful experiences, and there was huge empathy for what they had gone through on the one hand. On the other, you have to think that they come from a culture where the Anzac legend is the defining way in which people understand what Australians are like in war and how they experience war. And the Anzac legend is one of battlefield prowess. It's that the Anzacs are fine examples of Australian masculinity, that they're proud, that they're brave, that they're good fighters. And the experience of war as a prisoner, as you've just indicated, is the opposite of that. They're defeated, they're confined, they can no longer contribute. So immediately their war experiences are bumping up against what the dominant national narrative of Australians at war is telling them. And it's not just an Australian narrative, there's the broader, I think we would say, gendered language of war, where the battlefront is the male domain of heroism and valour and so on, and the home front is the more feminine domain. And the prison camp sits very uneasily between those two places. It's not the battlefront, but it's not the home front either. So what is it? So it sits really uncomfortably in this language and narrative of war, and the prisoners themselves do carry that burden with them of not quite fitting what war is meant to be and what their own national legend is meant to be. The other factor to consider is the Australian Army's attitude to the prisoners of war, which is they are very reluctant to highlight or commemorate or celebrate them in any way.
Yeah.
General Blamey refers to being a prisoner as a matter of dishonour in an internal document.
And this was after the end of the war. I mean,
That was during the war.
Right. And this view was pervasive through the 50s.
It was.
When you were speaking, it reminded me my grandfather had been deployed to Singapore as part of the Australian Imperial Forces, and he was, the Singapore fell very quickly, and so he didn't engage in any active combat, I don't believe. And so there were medals given to returning servicemen for participation in the war, but they had to have faced active combat. And my grandfather applied for one of these when he got back from Changi, and he was refused. The army refused.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, he was refused because he hadn't, even though he had sat for 3 years in Changi, not because he thought it was a great time, but because he had to, because he had gone there as a volunteer as part of the AIF. That wasn't good enough. And I understand that really pained him because he didn't have a medal then.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's important to say when we talk about how prisoners are placed in relation to our national narratives of war and the way we understand the front and the home front, people became prisoners because there was inadequate preparation for the defence of Singapore. The decision to surrender was made at a very high level. None of this should reflect on the individuals themselves.
No. One individual is not going to hold back the Japanese
Imperial
Army. So in 1949, the Chifley government is campaigning for re-election, and Menzies is leading the Liberal Party to its second ever election, and this one subsequently becomes its first victory. Why did the issue of the treatment of POWs become such an issue at that election, do you think?
Because there'd been a campaign in the late 1940s run by the RSL and a number of service organisations to recognise the special suffering that prisoners of war had undergone. And it was a campaign for what they called a subsistence allowance of 3 shillings a day or 3 bob a day. So it became known as the 3 bob a day campaign. And the case was put several times to the Chifley government.
And so a soldier who had not been captured, he invariably would have received some sort of a subsistence payment as a returned.
Everyone who was involved in the war received their pay.
Yeah.
When the prisoners of war were taken prisoner, they continued to receive their pay too.
Right.
So that was waiting for them, if you like, when they got home.
Okay.
But there was a campaign to say the army had not been required to give them food and shelter and clothing during those 3 years of captivity. They were denied that subsistence in a sense, and there was a recognition that their suffering had been very acute. And the service organisations got together and said, we'd like to provide what they called a subsistence allowance, an extra payment to people who'd been prisoners of war to recognise that their war had been particularly difficult. Now, what the Chifley government didn't say publicly was that the military establishment, and particularly the army, were opposed to any such payment because they feared that it would be a disincentive to fight on in any future wars, and they had told the government that. So the government knocked it back. But it was a popular campaign among the ex-service personnel, and as part of the 1949 election campaign, Menzies said, I realise that this is an issue for the service community, and what we will do if we're elected is that we will have a full inquiry into the matter. So It was an election promise that Menzies made to inquire into this matter.
And all the while, the Chifley government is not revealing that the advice of the army chiefs is not to persist with this plan.
Exactly. So my feeling is Menzies didn't know that.
No, probably not. But then, the idea of having an inquiry is then to flesh out the issues more, and, it's always it's a way of kind of deflecting responsibility too. But, we're talking quite a large constituency of people affected by this. 22,000 POWs who've returned home.
Yes.
But then they have families. So, you can magnify that by maybe 5 times, 10 times. So that's a fair rump of the electorate that would have been very focused on this issue, even if not all of them would have been in economic circumstances that would have necessitated them getting the support.
And I do think there was a sense in the community that POWs were having a hard time readjusting after the war.
More so than soldiers who had just been in active service.
Yes. Right. And the Repatriation Commission was determined to treat them not very differently from everybody else. And there were a number of public campaigns, philanthropic campaigns. One of them was led in Melbourne by Weary Dunlop. And there was a belief in the Australian community, I think, if you have suffered on behalf of the nation, it should be the nation's responsibility to support you to rehabilitate, and a sense that that wasn't really happening properly for these people.
Was the issue of POWs unique to World War II? Did we not experience this issue?
No, there were prisoners of war. No, there were definitely prisoners of war in the First World War.
To the same sort of extent, was it?
Yeah. Far more prisoners were taken in the Second World War. There were 8,000 taken in the European theatre and about 22,000 taken in the Asia-Pacific theatre. So that was a significant number, much higher than the First World War, about 3 times as many, I think. So very significant number.
And then there was also the issue of how they were treated by the Japanese versus how the Nazis, for example, would have treated them in Europe. The fatality rate of a Japanese POW versus a European POW was dramatically different, wasn't it?
Yes. So the fatality rate among people who were taken prisoner by the Japanese was about 1 in 3 or 33%, whereas among those taken by Germany and Italy was more like 3%.
Right.
So there was a huge distinction, and it meant that 1 in 3 former prisoners of war in post-war Australia had actually been taken by the European powers because of the high death rate among prisoners of the Japanese.
So the 8,000 who were taken as POWs and obviously perished during the process, they were almost all
of them
in the Japanese,
yes,
POW system. So that also adds another layer to it, that this was an issue of, the treatment of Australians by the Japanese and how we reconciled that post-war as well. We'd signed the soft peace treaty in 1950. 51. I was going to say 51, same as ANZUS, because they're linked.
They're of a piece.
And, we had been more generous than the Americans had expected us to be in signing that peace treaty. But the animosity towards the Japanese must have been huge in Australia.
It was, and I think the race of the captor was also an issue in terms of the response to the experience of captivity. And when you were talking before about shame, I think one element of the shame was the inability to fight on, but you have to cast your mind back to Australia in the first half of the 20th century. We had the White Australia policy. The Japanese were cast as a particularly uncivilised, barbaric enemy, but the very fact of defeat by Japan was an absolute shock to everyone. People could not believe that the British Army and British forces and the Dutch and the Americans had been defeated by the Japanese, who were constructed as being somewhat according to the racial logic of the day, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but were constructed as somehow inferior. So for an Australian soldier to be taken prisoner by the Japanese was almost an inversion of the racial hierarchy. So that's how you get the phrase white coolies,
Right.
which was a phrase that was sometimes used for men who were prisoners of the Japanese, because it's this inversion of who is meant to be controlling whom, according to the racial logics of the day. And that was an added element of problematic nature of being a prisoner of the Japanese, I think.
The inquiry that Menzies then holds after being elected at the end of 1949 ends up establishing the trust fund. It's not the 3 bob a day that the RSL and others had been advocating for. But, I mean, why does the trust fund work as a compromise between the concerns of the army, that it's funding people who don't have the ticket to fight and will dissuade people from signing up to fight in future wars, versus the other concern that these people have suffered for our country and deserve to be looked after by our country?
So the outcome of the inquiry that Menzies commissions after he is elected Prime Minister, and that is called the Owen Committee, which inquires into should there be a subsistence allowance payment. They fairly quickly become aware, because the military establishment tells them so, that it is not a desirable situation to give a subsistence payment, because according to their logic, it would be a disincentive to fight on in future wars. It would be a premium to surrender. So that committee comes down against paying a subsistence allowance. That is a hugely controversial outcome. People are outraged about the way that prisoners of war have been disparaged in the terms of that report.
Who's on that committee, Christina?
So it's Justice Owen, who's a New South Wales Supreme Court judge, Lieutenant Stanley Savage, who was the founder of Legacy after the First World War. He'd also been active in the Second World War, and Ted Fisher, who was head of the Council of the 8th Division, and he was a doctor. He himself had been a prisoner of war, and he published a dissenting report.
Right.
So Savage and Owen say no, and Fisher is beside himself and publishes a dissenting report saying...
So even within the committee, it's a controversial decision.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So the POW Trust Fund, in a way, is the compromise outcome that the government establishes, partly with the sale of seized Japanese assets, but they also put some funding towards it themselves. And so that's established in 1952. So it's established as a supplement, because all prisoners of war, of course, can apply to the Repatriation Commission for pensions, and pensions can be from totally permanently incapacitated all the way down to 10% for injuries received as a consequence of service. So the Prisoners of War Trust Fund is established as an add-on, which is very specific to prisoners of war, and they have to apply to a body of trustees and explain exactly why they are still experiencing ongoing disadvantage as a result of their captivity.
I mean, it's interesting. So they did have some money coming in if they had applied to the repatriation fund. So it's not like they're completely destitute.
Absolutely.
But this is this sort of extra kind of hardship payment that they could avail themselves of. And what was the process by which a returned POW could actually get some money from the trust fund?
So they had to fill out a form, and that in and of itself was controversial in some quarters, because some people just wanted it to be a standard payment rather than it be something that was judged by a body of trustees. So they had to describe what was the ongoing impact of captivity for them, what were their current assets and resources. So there was a perception in some quarters that perhaps it was being means tested. But the interesting thing for me as a historian is that people couldn't confine themselves to the 4 fool's cap pages that they were given to describe all these things. And some of them ended up writing much longer letters or engaging in a correspondence with the trust fund. And this gives us now an insight into the post-war experiences and the wartime experiences of these people, and particularly from the other ranks, people who are much less likely to leave behind diaries or letters. These are really unusual pieces of evidence from often young at the time that they were taken prisoner, relatively uneducated, working class people, what the impact of that experience of captivity had been. So it's a very rare resource that we have there.
What was the likelihood of being successful in your application to the trust fund?
I have to say it was very much contingent on how the application was read by the trustees. So people who could demonstrate ongoing disadvantage, who seem to be down on their luck, may well be successful in their claim. But because of the relatively small worlds of the ex-service community, sometimes the trustee might know the person. Sometimes the trustee might have pathways into other organisations like the Red Cross, or they would call for their records from the Repatriation Commission or hospitals. And there was an element of judgment in terms of respectability. So if people were known for being feckless, or if they had problems with gambling or alcohol, the trustees could decide that they would not be giving a payment to that person. So it was very contingent on the former prisoner being able to present themselves as a respectable person down on their luck, who had an ongoing disadvantage and who needed support for that.
That's a very tenuous point, isn't it? Because if you're down on your luck, you may very well be abusing alcohol and unable to hold down a job and be seen as feckless. So you can't be too down on your luck.
Exactly.
Just a bit down on your luck, but with your wits about you enough to apply for this and make a compelling case. Very tricky.
Really tricky.
What are the sorts of stories you read about that touched you the most, Christina?
So many.
Yeah, 7,000.
7,000.
What percentage got a payment of the 7,000?
I'm not actually sure of the precise percentage.
But in the end, they distribute, I think by the 70s, so it's closed in 77, open in 52, so it's open for 25 years. They distribute $1 million.
Yes.
So
and the average
doesn't
payment,
sound very much.
No, and the average payment was in the 50s and 60s. If you looked at the value of the money then and what it could purchase you, it could purchase you a new washing machine, but it couldn't buy you a new car.
Right.
So it wouldn't transform your life, but it might help you out of a fix, for example.
Yes.
But in terms of the poignant stories, one of the questions on the form, and this for me was one of the most fascinating parts of the whole record, one of the questions on the form asked the applicant, are you experiencing ongoing material prejudice as a result of your captivity? And at first I didn't quite know what I was reading when people were saying, oh, don't understand the question, what do you mean, not sure. And then other people started replying with long descriptions about their marriages. And I realised at some point that people were interpreting material prejudice as marital prejudice.
Oh, right.
And so it opened up this vein and
they just misread it.
All these wounds started running out of it.
So we would think it's some sort of financial impact.
Yes, it was meant to be what was the financial impact.
Yes.
But because, as I explained before, these are often less educated people who are writing to the fund, they don't quite understand what that means. And so, again, really unusual in terms of the evidence we have from the past. You get men writing about their experience of marriage, their experience of impotence, their sexual frustrations. It's all there. It's really quite astonishing stories that you read.
Yes, and especially in that period, you wouldn't have thought it was a, overly open period of Australian history for people to share those sorts of details about their intimate lives, and they're sharing it with a trustee. Where were they based, the trustees? Were they in Sydney or Melbourne?
In Melbourne.
But also, I mean, distant, but as you said, the community was quite close, the POW community. So, it's very, very intimate and revealing. It must have been incredibly brave to do that.
I think so. And what you hear or read in the stories of people who apply to the trust fund, you do see evidence of people living in tents, people moving from hostel to hostel, people's battles with alcohol, with authority at work. This is something that comes across really clearly, is that there's a core of people who, having been through that experience of subjection and control by guards, just can no longer tolerate authority over them, particularly in employment situations. And so you read people writing to the trust fund saying, I can't stick at a job. I can't deal with my employer. They write of their families, I hurt the ones that I love the most. I can't understand why I'm doing this. They're really powerful testimony to the ongoing impact of captivity long after people came home. And the other point that it's really important for us to remember, this is a period before the diagnosis of PTSD was available. That doesn't become available till 1980. And that's a really signal moment and a shift, because prior to that time, people who had psychiatric problems or psychological problems after the war were considered to have some pre-existing frailty or predisposition or weakness that meant that they developed a neurosis as a result of their wartime experience. So people who were disturbed and neurotic were considered to be somehow not right beforehand. Whereas after psychiatrists decide that there is a syndrome called post-traumatic stress disorder and that any normal person would respond negatively, or not necessarily everyone will respond negatively, but there can be an event that causes that damage rather than it being pre-existing. So we're speaking about a time where people who have a neurosis or psychiatric difficulties are considered somehow already damaged people.
Yes.
So it becomes very hard to talk about it. And of course, the advice being given out by the government is move on. The way you overcome these very difficult experiences is, as you indicated at the beginning, by not talking about them, by not focusing on them, by putting the past behind you. And most of the people who are taken prisoner are in their 20s. When they come back, they're at the prime of their lives. They're meant to be partnering, fathering, working.
Yeah, breadwinner. Yeah. And for so many of them, that became so very difficult. What about class? And, you have obviously officers and then regular soldiers. Were the types of people who were more impacted or less impacted related to their class level of education, their hierarchy in the army?
I think the experience of captivity itself was very mediated by rank.
Right.
So officers were more protected than the other ranks. It didn't always hold true, but they weren't meant to be able to be forced to work under the terms of the Geneva Convention. So officers were less likely to have some of the very hard experiences that are most famous among stories about prisoners of war. So there was already existing somewhat resentment that officers had not had as hard a time of it as other people had had. But when it came to how do you rehabilitate, if someone already had a higher level of education, if they came from a family that would be able to fold around them, hold them, help them get back on their feet, give them that space and time, that's an advantage of class and position that already makes that re-entry just that little bit easier, which is not to say that all of those people just sailed back into their lives completely unaffected. That's clearly not the case. But I think what the trust fund papers show us is that we have to ask the question, how significant was war experience to these people's life chances? Some of them take those injuries of disadvantage into the camps, and it means that they can't get over it so well when they come out again. So it's a bit of a snapshot of that mid-20th century Australia, in that some people are born with more advantages than others, and that can make a difference sometimes to your capacity to bounce back from a very difficult experience, that access to resources, the capacity to have time.
Was the typical person applying for funds from the trust fund, were they a regular soldier? Or?
Most of them were other ranks.
Yeah.
There were a few applications from officers who'd fallen on hard times. And my sense is the trustees were always far more understanding of those people because they recognised those difficulties and were inclined to be generous because there was no question about respectability or morality usually with those applicants. But they were far less likely to even be an applicant.
I see, yeah. In the 1949 election, 6 of the 7 POWs elected were elected to the coalition, to the Liberal and Country Party. I mean, my grandfather was one of them, and I think Ted Fisher and Albert Coates, were they also?
No, they were people who were active in the ex-service community, but Wilfred Kent Hughes was another.
Yeah. So what was the impact of having people like that in the parliament, do you think, who were part of this new government? Do you think that provided insights to the Menzies government that were important to, in the sort of respect and treatment for these POWs?
I think it did. It certainly was influential in getting the Owen Committee and the inquiry off the ground. But I think more than that, some of those people played a very important role in giving an example to the Australian community of how to effect a reconciliation with Japan.
Yeah.
And I would say Wilfred Kent Hughes was hugely important there because he adopted an attitude very much that it was important to take not just a pragmatic political rapprochement with Japan, but to demonstrate Christian forgiveness. And he was very motivated by that. And so he set an example that war itself was the enemy and that Australia and Australians needed to overcome their hostility to Japan in order to make their way in the post-World War world. So, and then Kent Hughes performed some very significant roles. So I think it's no coincidence, for example, that he was chairman of the organising committee for the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, because when Melbourne won the Olympics, there was actually quite a bit of controversy at the time about should Japan be allowed to participate in the Olympics.
Even though the war had been over
over
11 years by that stage, you'd think.
And I think in 1950, the International Olympic Committee allowed both Japan and Germany back in. But to have Kent Hughes, the former POW, as the front guy for the organising committee helped people sort of understand that it was important that...
So if he could forgive and be accepting, then, and he's experienced the worst of it, then everyone else should follow suit.
And he leads the debate on the peace treaty in the federal parliament. And he gives a very moving speech about how he has overcome some of his own hostility and that it's important for Australia's future and to exhibit humanity towards the Japanese people as well by signing a peace treaty. So he visits Japan, to the war cemeteries. He's very moved by seeing the results of the bombing in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, as are people like Albert Coates, who was a well-known POW doctor. So you have POWs both in the federal parliament and outside of it being on the front foot, trying to say, not all of them, some people will be bitter till the end, but there's a core who are working towards reconciliation.
Was there a level of animosity to the same degree towards Germany and Germans, say, participating in the Olympics, or it had a sort of a racial kind of element, do you think?
I think it very much had a racial element. And, of course, for Australia it was much closer to home and there was huge resentment because of the high death toll in Japanese captivity.
And that was reported on, the Germans and Italians, they didn't torture and engage in such acts of cruelty on our POWs as the Japanese did.
Yes.
There was sort of that
level was very well known.
Comparison.
And Australia was very determined to punish war criminals as well and wanted the severest form of punishment possible for war criminals. They eventually had to walk that back, of course, but there were some who didn't agree with that. For example, Weary Dunlop wouldn't go to the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which is the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, because he thought there was no point in that attitude towards punishment.
Yeah. The Menzies government obviously supports Wilfred Kent Hughes in his advocacy for the peace treaty, and then you have Harold Holt as immigration minister allowing 650 Japanese ward brides to remain to come to Australia, join their Australian husbands, which would have been quite against the White Australia policy of the era. But Menzies in 1954 makes this man-to-man broadcast and he's talking about reconciliation with Japan as something that you should do because we're a mature country and it's a manly thing to do. It's framing that whole debate around masculinity, that, be the better man. But it's interesting that the Labor Party at the time, led by Doc Evatt and Arthur Calwell, who then becomes opposition leader after Doc Evatt, they taunt Menzies that he's Jap happy, that there's sort of that the racial element in our politics was very, very strong, that was a legitimate criticism, obviously not of the governing side but from the opposition.
I think that was certainly a criticism made of Menzies by the Labor Party. It didn't land where they thought it would. It didn't have the political resonance, interestingly, that they had anticipated. And I think one thing that happens in this sort of 1950s period, late 1940s, early 1950s, is the Australian community does at some level begin to recognise what the logical endpoint is of that racial thinking.
Yeah.
We've just witnessed the liberation of the camps in Eastern Europe where racial ideology had been taken to its extreme in the Holocaust and with Nazi thinking. And there is a community response that begins to see bigotry and racial thinking as no longer acceptable in contemporary political life. Now, we know that is a very complicated story that has many twists and turns, but in relation to this particular issue, I do think that the Menzies man-to-man speech does have an impact and that the criticism of him from those quarters just doesn't land the way that they think it's going to.
What about the POW connections to other Asian countries? Because it wasn't just Australians who were captured, of course. I mean, you talk about your personal experiences in Malaysia at the Butterworth Air Base. And there were people across Southeast Asia who were captured or at least put under the administration of the Japanese imperial forces. Did that, I guess, shared experience with Australians and Australian POWs enhance the relations we had through the 50s and 60s?
I think so, because one of the consequences, not just of being a prisoner of war, but of participating in the Asia-Pacific War, is that vast numbers of Australians left the country for the first time and went into these regions, and they begin to understand that Asia is not just a mass of undifferentiated people, but there are Chinese and Indonesians and all sorts of different Asian cultures. So they become educated about the different parts of Asia. But they also, those who've been involved in the imprisonment experience, recognise how local people have helped them to endure that. And
the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. And
that's in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, and certainly in Malaysia and Singapore, the ethnic Chinese have been very helpful to the prisoners of war. And after the war, what you see is a large number of philanthropic initiatives where groups of service people are going back to the regions where they've been held prisoner and doing charitable works and so on. And the government actually creates the Australia British Reward Mission for people originally in Borneo, but then throughout the region, where they go around giving small cash payments and pensions to widows and people who have actually supported the prisoners in their moment of need and helped stand up to the Japanese in certain situations. So we think of the Second World War in the Asia-Pacific as a moment of conflict, and it certainly was, but it's also the beginning of our pathway into Asia and the cementing of relationships that are forged through that very difficult experience. Australians become more educated, they become more aware, and they want to reach out to people who have been helpful to them in this moment. So I really do think it has an impact on those regional relationships as well.
Yeah, and you wonder too, the Colombo Plan is launched in the 50s, and how the experiences of Australians during the war had formed a sort of foundation to then branching out to helping Asian nations with their education and economic development through the Colombo Plan, that we had those connections across the region.
And I think the wartime relationships then are also supplemented by the contemporary political situation. So Colombo Plan, of course, is very involved in Cold War politics, of demonstrating the value of the particular Australian/American/British way of life as opposed to a communist way of life. So these reward and recognition efforts are also, yes, they're coming from a place of wanting to say thank you, but they're also deeply imbricated in the politics of the Cold War, which is about, in a period of decolonisation, making communism less attractive to people and demonstrating the value of these kind of relationships. And on the reconciliation with Japan question, it's Australia who brings Japan into the Colombo program.
As a donor, not as a recipient, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it could have gone a very different way, couldn't it? I mean, obviously the Menzies government and others have learnt from the experience of First World War and the Treaty of Versailles and bringing Germany to its knees, and the impact that has obviously then into the lead up to the World War II. But this idea that, Japan's actually got to be prosperous and develop, and we bring Japan into our family of nations, liberal democratic family, and make sure that it doesn't go into sort of the clutches of the communist countries, that we will benefit as well as Japan will benefit.
That's right. And one of the other key treaties and agreements negotiated in the early 1950s, the peace treaty was one of them, but the trade treaty was the other. And Menzies' speech that you mentioned earlier about political maturity, it was completely contemporaneous with getting the trade agreement across the line. And that relationship, we were the first country to give Japan most favoured nation trading status. Our economy and the Japanese economy grew on the back of those kind of trade agreements. So it was the foundation of Australia's post-war prosperity to have very positive trading relationship with Japan. And Japan was our most important trading partner for a very long time.
Indeed, indeed. I wanted to end our conversation today, Christina, by talking about the Anzac myth. So you spoke at the beginning of the Anzac myth of, strong warrior, brave, obviously very masculine, as opposed to a sort of an image of a POW who's, surrendered and captured and frail and weak, and it's still masculine in that they're male invariably, although there were some females. But that by the time we get to the 80s, that Anzac myth can encapsulate both. And how does that change our relationship as everyday Australians to that Anzac myth, do you think?
I think Anzac has become a much more capacious category, if I can say so, in the last sort of 30 years. And I think at the end of the Vietnam War, there was a real sense that the national mythology of Anzac, that Anzac Day commemorations itself, it may be in its death throes, basically, because that war had been so divisive. One of the consequences of the Vietnam War was also to start focusing on the victims of war and the negative consequences of war. And it also coincided with the coming of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And these things together begin a reflection where people start to look for, well, who has war impacted? Who has suffered for war? Anzac, prior to that, was about a celebration of Australia's performance in war and an acknowledgement of suffering and service. But there's a tipping point by the early 1980s where there's a desire to look more to the cost of war, the people who have suffered the most for it. And prisoners of war emerge at that moment as the people who have actually sacrificed a huge amount for the nation. They're not warriors. They're not associated with the negative parts of militarism. They're people for whom sympathy is warranted. And it's that tipping point that I think starts to bring an audience back to Anzac as well, because they're focused on as people who can tell us something different about the nature of suffering and the commitment to the country that they've exhibited.
Well, I think that's a really good note to end on, and a poignant note to end on. And thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light, Christina.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.